I already made a video explaining why the U.S. military needs to stay the heck out of Mexico back in November. But this is a bad idea that keeps growing, so I guess here's part 2. In recent weeks, this bad idea has metastasized beyond New York Times militarists and Tom Cotton to include a no-hope Republican presidential candidate and Mr. Axis of Evil himself, David Frum, writing in The Atlantic. These clowns aren't reaching a mass audience yet, but others are. Thankfully for my chances with YouTube's drama-seeking algorithm, on February 3rd, the channel Task and Purpose published a video called Mexican Cartels Are Worse Than You Think. The video has racked up more than 1.5 million views. It's very informative, but seems to me to be a barely concealed case for using the U.S. military in Mexico. There's a lot in the video that is very true, but it can also be used to justify this insanely bad idea. Before we get into this, let's do a little throat clearing. Unlike a lot of the outlets that I critique on this channel, I have a lot of respect for Task and Purpose. The organization is a lot more than just a YouTube channel. It's based on the idea that U.S. service people desperately need their own journalistic voice, and I couldn't agree with that idea more. I was too chicken shit to serve, and I have immense respect for the bravery of those who did. This respect is not undermined in the slightest by my infinite disrespect for what they were asked to do by the morons in charge over the past 22 years. I don't know much about Chris Cappy, the Task and Purpose YouTube presenter, but I enjoy some of his work, admire his success on this platform, and go forward with this video in the firm knowledge that, as a veteran, he has sacrificed far more for this country and the issues discussed than I ever will. Alright, throat cleared. I remember reading about how horrible the conflict in Fallujah in Iraq was, all 3 or 4 times that the United States fought to take it. Well, I believe that this Task and Purpose video helps to lay the groundwork necessary to bring Fallujah-level conflicts into the United States. First, let's talk about why this video exists. As I've mentioned on this channel repeatedly, Vladimir Putin gave us a temporary reprieve from another trillion-dollar war in the Middle East. With the end of the war in Afghanistan, the military-industrial complex was looking for something to do, and the people of Iraq, Syria, and Iran got an incredible gift when Russia invaded Ukraine. The attention of Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and their employees in the U.S. Congress shifted north, and it should stay there for a while. The war on terror was fundamentally about money spinning in Washington, D.C., and Putin's invasion has been the biggest bonanza since the Afghanistan surge. First javelins, then millions of artillery rounds, and now tanks are streaming into Ukraine. It may take a while before we start selling F-35s to Zelensky, but we are now selling bushels of those super expensive planes to every European country that has 2 pennies to rub together. Washington, D.C. is happy. The defense companies and their congressmen are happy. But there is a tremendous war on terror constituency that has been left out of this bonanza entirely. And that's the exact constituency that Task and Purpose claims to serve. The U.S. fighting man and woman. Soldiers love peace, but they also love jobs. And the Ukraine war really doesn't give U.S. soldiers much of anything to do. Now, I assume that most veteran, enlisted, and low-level officers from the past few decades are delighted that their brothers and sisters have fewer opportunities to die for defense industry profits. But there are many, many individuals and institutions that don't have that luxury because their careers and their mortgages depend on wars that U.S. warfighters are allowed to participate in. The biggest and dumbest things that the U.S. government has done this century are probably the Iraq and Afghanistan surges. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were mobilized for these spectacularly failed enterprises. But tens of thousands of careers and many of the country's largest institutions were also warped around idiotic ideas of counterinsurgency, which explains a lot of the weird definition talk in the Task and Purpose video.
I think we're finally at a point where these cartels should be defined as a commercial insurgency and major threat to the U.S. national security interests. It's been suggested the United States should officially recognize cartels as a foreign terrorist organization, but I don't agree. That move would further alienate Mexico. However, on the other hand, the resources that would become available if they were recognized as a terrorist organization could be of great benefit.
Much of the U.S. Army and Marine Corps, as well as the think tank, university, and contractor ecosystems that are built up around them, are feeling pretty left out by the Ukraine war. And there isn't much for them to do around China currently either. Redefining Mexican cartels as commercial insurgencies or especially terrorist organizations would give these military branches the leeway necessary to move beyond intelligence gathering and border security to direct fighting on Mexican soil. Of course, the normal Army and Marine Corps wouldn't start out doing the fighting. It would start with the U.S. Special Operations Command, if it isn't in Mexico already. The past 2 decades of the War on Terror saw this unified combatant command given extraordinary resources, shocking and dubiously constitutional independence from oversight by Congress and the other military branches, secret budgets, and still largely secret missions. We trained up tens of thousands of the scariest killers in human history, and most of them are still in the middle of their careers. Some of them work for the government, but thousands work in the rapidly metastasizing armed mercenary sector all around the world. And there isn't anything for them to do. There's no current way for these guys to get paid in our competitions against Russia and China. And that's where all this agitation for using the U.S. military in Mexico is coming from. The Special Forces lost in Afghanistan, and they can no longer operate there. Well, as far as we know, they are no longer operating there. Africa has probably been the largest playground for U.S. Special Forces and contractors of the past decade, and as I pointed out at great length in a recent video, they have brought nothing but ruin and coups to the continent. I'm confident that Socom is doing good work training Ukrainian soldiers in Poland at the moment, but that isn't going to get any officers any promotions or get them on the cover of Time magazine. Which explains why Task and Purpose is trying to get the United States involved in some all-American Fallujahs.
On January 6, 2023, the Mexican military sent 3,000 soldiers to capture El Chapo's son, Avidio Guzman, in the city of Culiacan. Gang members set fire to vehicles and used them as roadblocks while shooting .50 caliber rifles at military and civilian aircraft, shutting down the local airport for the entire day. Mexican military helicopters rained down heavy machine gun fire onto the Sinaloa cartel gang members.
Now, I'm not saying this is a bad video. In fact, I think it's a pretty great video. It organizes information effectively and provides a mostly accurate picture of the horrific situation in Mexico. Cartel violence is bad, and it's not getting better. It's the main thing standing in the way of Mexico becoming a Poland-level developed economy and becoming the perfect destination for U.S. manufacturing scraped out of China. That's all very true. And Chris Cappy and Task and Purpose are a lot more sane than David Frum in The Atlantic or Brett Steffens in The New York Times, who seem to want to regime change the Mexican president. Cappy knows that it's the cartels that are the problem, not President Obrador's reversing the last Mexican president's oil privatization. The U.S. and Mexican governments need a better relationship to fight the cartels, not a worse one. And unlike Senator Tom Cotton or that deranged no-hope Republican presidential candidate, Cappy never outright says he's in favor of a U.S. Special Forces invasion of Mexico. But he doesn't say it's a bad idea either. He clearly states that the cartels are a national security threat to the United States. And the whole theme of the video, defining cartels as a commercial insurgency, seems tailor-made to justify stepped-up U.S. involvement. Perhaps I'm being unfair, but this Task and Purpose video strikes me as helping to lay the groundwork for a U.S. military intervention in Mexico. The video is more reasonable and informative than the bloodthirsty nonsense being pushed by the chicken hawks in our prestige press, but it's pushing in the same bad direction. And I think that direction is fucking nuts. Do you remember how much worse Iraq was from 2003 to 2011 than it ever was in Afghanistan or all the special forces work in Africa? Twice as many service people died in the Iraq War, even though it was less than half as long as the Afghanistan one. That's because the U.S. military was trying to operate in urban environments against Iraqis who were 5 to 10 times richer and better armed than the Afghans or Sahel region Africans ever were. Well, the average Mexican today is 10 times richer and much, much better armed than the Iraqis of 2003 were. In the Middle East, the U.S. military fought and lost against a bunch of poor religious fanatics from ancient civilizations whose best idea for defending their countries was most often blowing themselves up. In Mexico, we would be fighting Americans, heavily armed North Americans with a similar hyper-nationalist culture to our own and 200 years of built-up resentment they'd just love to take out on some invading gringos. I can't fathom why anybody thinks this would be a good idea. U.S. forces in Mexico would add nothing but chaos. And that chaos would not stay in Mexico. Task and Purpose makes a very good point.
The Drug Enforcement Agency themselves said, quote, "While direct related violence in Mexico remains a concern, there is minimal spillover violence into the United States, as U.S.-based Mexican transnational criminal organizations generally refrain from inter-cartel violence to avoid detection and increased scrutiny by law enforcement."
So how long do you honestly think that restraint would last if U.S. Special Forces started attacking the cartels on their home turf? I assume there would be some large and really nasty reprisals against American citizens either in Mexico or in the United States. And of course, we couldn't back down in the face of that terrorism, so we would escalate. And then the cartels would escalate, back and forth. The U.S. Army and Marine Corps would get their chance to get into the game. And then very quickly, we could have exactly the same kind of nightmarish violence that Mexico has, all over the United States. Oh, and it's not like the cartels would have to infiltrate the United States to bring us this hell. They're already here.
However, the DEA did find that the Mexican cartels are operating in at least 60 different American cities, from Florida to Bellingham, Washington.
It's estimated that the Taliban beat the United States military on a budget of about $400 million a year. The most conservative estimates hold that the Mexican cartels have $6 billion a year to deploy, and it's probably more like $15 to $30 billion. All that money certainly means more and scarier weapons, but it also means that they can corrupt almost anybody.
The Mexican government disbanded the federal police, which was plagued with corruption accusations in 2019.
It's nice to think that our soldiers would be above that sort of thing, but there's nothing on the record to indicate that. There's actually a lot of evidence to the contrary. In Africa's Sahel region, an infinitely poorer territory than Narcoland, the Navy SEALs and others have managed to disgrace themselves quite thoroughly. Truly unleashing U.S. Special Forces on Mexico would almost certainly turn history's greatest killing machines into history's most corrupt killing machines. That's how republics fall, folks. Not Mexico's, ours. It's just a really bad idea. Now, after all of this cynicism I've delivered, the appropriate question would be, well, what would you do about this terrible problem, Rob? Just leave it alone? Well, the first thing I would do is define the problem accurately, something that Task and Purpose gets tantalizingly close to doing.
The first official action by the Mexican military against the cartels started on December 11, 2006, when the newly elected Mexican president Felipe Calderon sent 6,500 federal troops into Michoacán to put an end to the drug cartel there. This is where Mexico's war on drugs really began, and since then, thousands of Mexican politicians, students, and journalists have met their untimely end in the conflict each year. In 2007, the United States started to help in Mexico's war on drugs, and the two took a very militaristic approach.
This is a really key thing to notice here. We like to pretend that Calderon, probably Mexico's worst president, just called these horrific narco wars into existence all on his own. But you'll note that they started in December of 2006, and by early 2007, the United States just happened to have a massive tens of millions of dollars supporting initiative ready to go. I mean, come on. We, in the United States, forced, or bribed, or blackmailed, or maybe even just persuaded these narco wars into existence.
In 2007, the United States started to help in Mexico's war on drugs, and the two took a very militaristic approach.
They started something called the Merida Initiative, which assists Mexican security forces and trains them and equips them in ways to fight corruption and criminal organizations. The US has spent about $3 billion since then on the Merida Initiative, but it's only really left the cartels fractured into 150 different organized crime gangs instead of the handful that they were before. They did this in order to avoid capture. Is the military approach to fighting the war on drugs not a viable solution then?
Yes, it's clearly not a viable solution. It's the whole frickin' problem. Perhaps the worst omission in this task and purpose video is that Cappy never mentions that before Bush and Calderon launched this horrific war, Mexico was a much more peaceful, stable, and better governed place. It certainly wasn't perfect, but it wasn't what we have now. It's the breaking up of the cartels that made Mexico so violent and ungovernable. You can see here that before Bush and Calderon's drug war, there were around 10,000 murders in Mexico a year. Not great, but proportional by population to what we have in the United States today. Numbers vary, but since the drug war started, that number has escalated to at least 30,000 a year.
So hey, kind of a big note from the editing process. Occasionally when I'm putting together graphics, I'll notice something that requires revisions of the video, but this one's kind of a doozy. You notice that? So that is, despite every anti-AMLO screed I've read in English over the past 3 or 4 years, despite what this Cappy guy says in the Task and Purpose video, that is murders going down every year of AMLO's presidency. Of course, murder is still too high, but this looks like a situation that is beginning to be solved. This looks like a tactic that is working despite the pushback of everybody in the Mexican and U.S. law enforcement industries pushing against it. It's quite stunning that this is not something that is mentioned at all in the Task and Purpose video, and honestly makes me a little more hostile to it. So here are 2 clips from Task and Purpose video that are just flatly wrong.
Since 2006, Mexico has seen more than 360,000 homicides, and the rate continues to increase each year.
Nope, that's not true. Every year since AMLO has been president, the murder rate has gone down in Mexico. It's amazing. I did not know that. It's amazing that nobody's talking about that.
Obrador said, quote, "Violence cannot be confronted with violence. Fire cannot be extinguished with fire. Evil cannot be confronted with evil." And the thing is, Obrador has a really good point here. The last approach did fail to stop the cartel, but it now appears that the new hugs not bullets approach has also failed.
Nope. Has not failed. Seems to be succeeding. Really important detail that Task and Purpose and everybody else writing on this topic seems to miss.
So it turns out that Mexico's narco wars come from the same source of anarchy as the Iraq War and North Korea's nuclear bomb. The presidential administration of George W. Bush, our worst and most violent leader since Woodrow Wilson. The first step to fixing this is admitting how terribly, terribly wrong the military approach was. Igniting the Mexico narco war was arguably a worse choice and certainly a more dangerous one for the United States than the war in Iraq ever was. But nobody in U.S. discourse wants to admit that, least of all Task and Purpose. We're desperately addicted to the idea that more violence can solve the current violence, even though that's the exact strategy that created the current situation. Obrador, Mexico's current president, has tried to move in a different direction, but has faced tremendous pushback in the U.S. and in Mexico. He has never been able to implement the hugs not bullets policy that Cappy claims has already failed. Obrador's made some nice speeches about it, and all he's gotten for his trouble is articles calling for his head in both the Atlantic and the New York Times. And that's too bad, because President Obrador seems to be the only person who's talking any sense. We need to go back to 2006. Now that we've created a narco war this violent, the Mexican government pretty much just has to pick a winner if it wants to establish any kind of security. Hugs not bullets isn't just the only viable option at this point. I'm pretty convinced it's the one we're inevitably going to go with anyway. It's just a question of how many more hundreds of thousands of people are going to die before we get over ourselves and accept reality.
So it turns out I was wrong as well. Hugs Not Bullets appears to be working, and working fairly well. Yes, the murders are way too high, but we've seen a peak. We've got a policy that functions, and that puts this whole Washington, D.C. military-industrial complex push for involvement in Mexico in a different light. I kind of wonder if we're seeing like a New York City crime wave situation here. In the 1980s, we had this horrible, horrible crime wave, and this mayor named David Dinkins started putting things in place that started to solve the problem. Murders actually started falling dramatically in the last couple years of his administration. So what you had was a security apparatus, and a bunch of people who didn't want to give him credit for getting things right, didn't want to give Local Solutions credit. So the candidate of the suburbs, Rudy Giuliani, came in and has been given credit by the national media ever since for curing New York's crime problem. So I kind of wonder if that's what we're seeing here as well. Washington, D.C., many people in Washington, D.C. have looked on in horror at the war in Mexico, but I think a lot of other people saw an opportunity. Maybe we can put U.S. Special Forces in here or something. And that opportunity, thanks to President Obrador, may be slipping away. So this could be like a Giuliani style. Well, let's throw in a whole bunch of violent solutions so it can take credit for, a positive trend that was already happening. That's one possibility. But actually, it's pretty cool that murders are falling in Mexico, and not something that I think people talk about much. Hopefully Obrador's approach will continue working, or continue being allowed to work. Hopefully we don't regime change him or send in a bunch of military forces that make the problem much, much worse.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And have I mentioned recently that I have an email list? If I lose access to any of these platforms, it will be the only way for me to reach my audience. Please do sign up, either at the link here or the link in the video description. Thanks.